The Battle for Moriah, Chapter 17. After the battle with the Mazikim, the army regrouped in the farmer's field outside the village. Joab called the roll. More than 40 men were dead or missing, among them Caleb. Dozens of others were injured. Gideon sat alone in the field looking at the dark night. Why had the king allowed this? Why would the king allow them to suffer so many losses? Couldn't he have sent out Reuben's men? Or Jeroboam's? Or... there just wasn't enough fighters. Could the king have prevented it? If so, why didn't he? If not, why not? How could they win the war and defeat the enemy if they could not even win this small battle? Gideon knew that blaming the king was unfair. This was just the way things had gone. The king had enemies, and Caleb and the others had been chosen to defend the kingdom. And every one of them had known that in so doing their lives would be at stake. But still, these questions and doubts plagued him. Joab came and sat with him. "How are the men?" Gideon asked. "Frustrated," Joab said. "All the gains we made today in territory were lost. Now we've fled the village altogether. Our little king's territory has been completely wiped out." "Not to mention our losses," Gideon said. "I think their losses were greater than ours," Joab said. "Most of their army was under the wall when the arrows started flying." "Caleb was there too," Gideon pointed out. The two sat in silence for a time. Gideon wept silently while Joab stared at the ground. Finally, Gideon broke the silence. "The men will need our leadership. What do we do now?" "We can't stay in the fields. We'd be sitting ducks," Joab said. "Come, let's go to the nearby farmhouses. We'll put a few men on guard and let the rest of them get some sleep. That will give us the opportunity to tend to the wounded as well." Gideon agreed, so they rounded up the men and led them further from the village. The small army marched across the fields and came to the first farmhouse. It had been burnt down to the ground. Only a charred skeleton remained. Gideon knew the family that had lived there. It was one of the families they had escorted into the castle. Near the burnt-out farmhouse was a barn, which had not been burnt. Joab looked at Gideon, who nodded. They rolled the large barn door open. It was dark inside and very quiet. There did not seem to be any livestock. One soldier found a lantern and managed to get it lit. They found in one stall in the barn a horse that had been mutilated and killed by the Mazikim. And here was a dog that had suffered the same fate. Gideon sat with his back to the wall, and again the tears rolled down his face. "It's all too awful," he said to Joab. Joab understood. He began to give directions and had the bodies of the horse and the dog removed from the barn, along with the bloodied hay. He and his men were exhausted, so for the time that was all they felt they could do. 4 men were assigned to guard the barn, 1 near each of its 4 walls. 4 others were assigned to tend to the wounded. They had no bandages or medical equipment. They had to use only pieces of ripped clothing. The men on duty would be relieved after 3-hour shifts. The rest of the men found places in the hay to lie down. Gideon was already asleep, his back to the wall. Joab himself found a position in the loft and fell exhausted into sleep. Shechem awoke early the next morning, cold, as dew had settled on the camp in the night. Most of the camp was still sleeping, but Shechem had slept uneasily. He felt his duty to watch over the girl keenly, that mixed with other tensions towards her. However, when he sat up and looked to the spot where she had been bound, he discovered that she was missing. He had a sickening sensation, as if something inside him were being twisted. He knew he would be brought before the dragons. He looked around desperately. Where was she? Upon examining the ropes that had bound her, he realized they'd been cut somehow. It looked like it had been done with a crude blade, maybe even just a sharp stone. He briefly considered his options. Deserting seemed to be the only chance he had to escape with his life. But now someone approached. To his horror, he discovered that it was Sanballat himself. Sanballat looked at the ropes on the ground and then at Shechem. "The dragons request an audience. Come with me." Sanballat did not even look to see if Shechem would obey, yet Shechem did not dare try to make a break for it now. He was led away from the camp to another clearing where he found several of the dragons gathered. There in the midst of them was the headless corpse of a man, stripped of his armor. Next to the corpse lay the man's head, and Shechem saw that it was Holofernes. "How do you explain this?" Ra demanded. Shechem was at a loss. Was he being blamed for this murder? I don't know, sir." "Neither do I," Ra replied. "There are two probable causes that we have determined. One is that your prisoner attempted to escape and somehow overpowered this loyal general when he intervened. The other is that you, who were witnessed having a conflict with him in view of everyone, and who has a reputation of making rash decisions, assassinated him in the night." "I did nothing of the sort," Shechem protested. "I slept the whole night through." Ra smiled. "Not very prudent for one looking after so valuable a prisoner, is it?" Again, Shechem did not know what to say. "Suppose the girl did escape," Ra said. "Suppose she overpowered an important man like Holofernes and chopped off his head. A warrior, defeated by a pampered girl in a nightgown, who'd been bound and was being supervised. Our camp would be thrown into confusion. People would begin to speculate that perhaps we dragons and our general Sanballat, perhaps we are all incompetent. Men might begin to panic and to abandon our ranks. And of course, the plan would never work without the princess, now would it?" The dragons and the men present shook their heads as though they were considering this awful possibility for the first time. "It'd be much better for us," Ra went on, "if it had in fact been a murder from within our own ranks. Justice could be easily served, the murderer could be dealt with, and the princess would be moved to a more secure, secret place." Shechem looked around at all the dragons, nodding their heads in agreement. "So, then you have the princess?" "Of course we do," Ra said. "I just explained to you what happened. Holofernes was murdered by one of our own. Justice will be served, and everything else will go on according to plan." With that, the dragons all turned and began leaving the clearing and returning to the camp. Shechem was left alone with one other man. The other man was Sisera, the assassin. He silently pulled out a blade and administered the dragon's justice. Chapter 18. Solomon and Deborah walked around the castle, watching the progress of their people. Jeroboam had done well to establish his police as a peacekeeping presence in the city, and he was winning back the trust of the people. Many said that if the king had put him in that position, then the king himself trusted Jeroboam, and so they would follow suit. Jeroboam would have to learn to trust himself as well, but soon he was giving orders and directions with confidence again. Deborah had given instructions for a hospital to be built. It was erected as a large tent in the outer courtyard. So far, most of those who needed care were injured from attacks by the Mazikim, yet their injuries ranged from burns to deep wounds to broken bones. Some would have to have amputations unless their cuts healed properly. They had plenty of clean water flowing through Hezekiah's tunnel, yet other supplies were lacking. She had given Reuben instructions that if possible, the soldiers outside the walls should get more supplies inside the castle walls before the siege started. Deborah knew as well that once the siege started, there would be other problems, disease, and possibly even malnourishment. There were too many people in too little space, but the people chose to work together, and that relieved some of the tension. For now, the nurses would have to keep tending to the wounded. Queen Miriam herself assumed the position as head nurse with the blessing of the king. She taught the other nurses that it was not medicine alone that would heal the wounded, but love. She moved from cot to cot, listening to the stories of the injured, tending to them, loving them, and weeping for them. So to Deborah and Solomon, who surveyed the scene, all looked well. Several men and even some women and boys were being taught by Reuben and his guards how to wield weapons. The blacksmith was busy turning out swords and arrows, and he too had gathered apprentices. The castle armory was already well stocked, but they would need every weapon possible when war broke out. Even the elderly were put to work sewing what cloth they could find into tents, which began to fill the outer courtyard. Eli had been given the commission of training those who would be known as special operations. It was unclear what their task would be, but the king had given Eli instructions and had hand-selected those members of the kingdom who would be assigned this task. The special operations team was being trained inside the dining hall of the palace. Every room had been transformed for its new purpose, most into sleeping quarters. The dining hall was considered appropriate for training the special operations team, as it was away from the main courtyard where there could be silence. Deborah and Solomon stood at one end, watching the training with interest. The king had selected his team, yet here was a surprise. The team consisted of 2 young girls, 1 young boy, several women, a tailor, and an old paralyzed man who had to be carried. One of the women Solomon recognized as a woman whose character and reputation were questionable. Eli was addressing them. "Remember, the power of Moriah is not something you can wield like a sword. You must rather allow it to wield you. It is not your tool, you are its. You will know what it is that you must do. It will not speak to you in words, but you will have an assurance that you are heeding its will." "Sir," one of the girls interrupted, "how can you speak of it as having a will? It's only a force, isn't it?" "It is more than a force," Eli said. "In fact, in a sense it is a person, though not the way we tend to think of the term person. You, as a person, are only a mere shadow of the manner in which it is a person. Therefore, you cannot hope to understand it any more than you can hope to master or wield it. But you can come to know it, just as you would a person. Now then, in order to be useful to Moriah, you must hone your skills." At these comments, Solomon turned to Deborah. "I don't understand why the king has selected these people for his special operations. They have nothing to offer, no wisdom, no skill or strength." "Perhaps the power of Moriah only works through the humble," Deborah said. "The proud would get in the way. Would you let yourself be a tool?" Solomon ignored the question. "I have serious doubts that there is such a power. I grant you that Eli seems to have been emboldened by his experience in the jail cell, but I see nothing more here. I should not be surprised that a man of Eli's position would have a sense of crisis upon being arrested and treated like a common criminal. The sense of crisis would have in turn fueled an overactive imagination." "But he was set free," Deborah pointed out. "Perhaps," Solomon said, "but there are other possibilities. One is that the cell was not closed properly, and so escaping it was not a problem. Another is that the jailkeeper, not wanting to obey Jeroboam in something that was clearly unjust, set Eli free, and the story was created in order to keep the jailer out of trouble." "So, you think Eli is lying?" Deborah said. "Not so much lying as telling a story," Solomon qualified. "A story that would unite the people behind a common cause, motivate them to do good, and, most of all, inspire hope. This is why I mention this to you, but not the others. I agree that the people must be motivated and hopeful for the upcoming war, but this special operations team takes it too far. Training children and prostitutes into a withered old man. Should these people represent us? Some of those women should have been banished from the kingdom altogether, and yet here the king gives them a position of honor." "I trust the king," Deborah said flatly. "I trust him as a warrior, as a tactician, as a good man. But I don't think he is wise. Or more likely, he knows the truth, that there's no power in Moriah, but he also knows that his people are fools, and that he can fool them into obeying him." "What if there is power?" Deborah asked. Solomon laughed. "Yes, what if there is?" he said, smirking. "Deborah, you're much too wise to believe these fairy tales. It's too ridiculous. It's good enough for them," he said, gesturing to Eli and those he was training. "But it's ridiculous to think that the wise would accept it. The king recognizes our wisdom. He knows we'll see through the game. History is full of myths, and we need only to recognize that so that we don't live believing them today." "What hope is there for us if it's not true?" Deborah asked. I do not choose to believe or not to believe based upon whether it produces positive or negative emotions in me, but based on irrefutable evidence. If it is not true, then you're right. We have no hope. But I won't believe it simply to feel better. Deborah was silent at this. She knew she had no evidence to offer. What could there be? There was a mystery to the power. It could not be detected through the senses. It influenced behavior and influenced the material world in other ways that could not be explained. Solomon demanded evidence for the power of a type that was simply not possible. After a while, Solomon spoke again. "Come with me. I want to show you something." He led Deborah through the series of halls and rooms that led through the castle to their private chambers. As advisors to the king, Deborah and Solomon and Daniel were each given private chambers inside the castle. They had their homes outside the walls, where Daniel and Solomon each lived with their families. Deborah never married, so she used her home outside the walls as a home for girls in need. Solomon brought her into his own chamber and pulled back a curtain near the back wall. Deborah gasped. Behind the curtain was an assortment of statues and pillars and masks, and a full-sized Asherah pole. "You have an Asherah pole right in the castle?" Deborah was astonished. "Do you see?" Solomon said. "If there was, in fact, some sort of supernatural power of Moriah, don't you think that Eli or the king or Gideon or Caleb would have known about this? But they didn't, and they don't. The power of Moriah is not supernatural. It's not even a real power, so to say. It is merely sentimentality, love for our kingdom, and the zeal that it motivates. This is the change we've seen in Eli. He's gone from being timid to being bold. And it's true. This is precisely the kind of thing that will help us win the war. But as rational people, we cannot actually accept the existence of the power. It's a disservice to our intelligence." Looking again at the pole, he added, "It's good enough for the people, a great motivator, but we are above it." "But you believe in the power of the Asherah pole," Deborah pointed out. "Yes and no," Solomon answered. "It would be arrogant to deny that it has power. After all, so many believe in it. Above all, we must be open-minded if we wish to be wise. But I believe that the power of the pole is not some superstitious hocus-pocus. It is psychological. The power of it unites us as we choose to honor it. So you see, I don't believe that because I have the pole in my house that it does anything to me from the external, but it indicates something about me internally, my strength, my wisdom. That is why I've collected and preserved this and all these other artifacts." Deborah did not know what to say. She believed that the pole was actually evil, not merely symbolic of evil, that the pole itself had a power. Supposing there was some power associated with it, would it affect Solomon if he did not believe in it? It was merely an ornament for him, an intellectual curiosity. But then, he was directly defying the king. If he was so confident that the pole was merely a statue, then he should have the courage to present it to the king and see what he said. But if the king rejected it, as Deborah and Solomon both knew very well that he would, then he clearly ought to obey the king out of humility and loyalty. Deborah struggled with this, as she did not want to appear proud or self-righteous, and yet she did not want to appear naive and superstitious. All the while, though, she felt uncomfortable just being in the room with the pole. She felt as though the pole were somehow polluting the castle, which was otherwise free of these things, or so she believed. She wanted to be out of the room, and she would figure out what to do about it later. "Well, this has all been very interesting," Deborah said, "but probably we should get back to our duties. The kingdom needs us." Solomon smirked. "You're uncomfortable with this, aren't you?" "Frankly, yes," Deborah said. "I feel that being the king's advisors, his inner circle, we are expected to be above reproach." "Well, I believe that when the reproach is unwarranted, it is the fault of the reproacher, not the reproached." "Either way, we need to get back. I don't like being in the room with that thing." Deborah pointed at it like it was a monstrosity. "Will you tell the king about it?" Solomon asked. "I've always had a very open relationship with the king," Deborah said. "I am not one to keep things from him." As she said this, Solomon moved towards the door, In a quick movement, he left the room, closing the door behind him and locking it. "Open this door, Solomon," Deborah yelled. She banged on the door, feeling a sense of panic welling up in her. "I don't trust you to respect my choices," Solomon said calmly. "If you will insist on imposing your small-minded morality on me, then I'm afraid that you must be prevented from doing so. It's not me who has you locked up. It's your small-minded legalism." With that, Solomon walked away, leaving Deborah locked in his chamber with the pole. Joab had only slept a few hours when he woke up and found himself staring at the barn roof. The sun was coming up and shone through the slits between the boards that contrived the walls. Outside, he could hear birds chirping. The air smelt fresh and clean. From where he lay, he could not believe what had transpired the day before. He felt a lingering heaviness, but now in the sweetness of the morning it seemed like a long time ago. He was astonished that after everything that had happened, the sun would still rise. Clouds would roll on by like any other day. Birds would sing. He lay still, not wanting to disturb the 100 or so soldiers that slept in the barn with him. He realized that the Mazikim only came out at night. How many of them there were left he could not guess, but he knew that if he was to effectively battle them, there would have to be one last push to the castle walls, and then every last soldier would have to go over by ladder, or perhaps the gates could be opened. This seemed like the better idea. He knew Reuben would be reluctant to allow this breach, but if he and his guards watched the area with their arrows, surely the Mazikim would not attack over 100 armed men in broad daylight. He decided there was no time to lose. The sun had risen now, and everything must be done during daylight hours. He went about the barn, quietly waking the men who were capable of fighting. He allowed those who were severely injured to keep sleeping. Gideon, too, was left alone, still in the same place with his back against the wall. Once the able-bodied men were assembled outside, he did a head count. 78 men in total remained for this last task, but they were good warriors and trustworthy men. He split the group into 4 contingents and sent them each a different direction outside of the village. For now, they were to explore the neighboring farmhouses, find survivors, supplies, and weapons, and bring them back to the barn. The barn would remain as headquarters. 4 men would be left to care for the injured and to guard the headquarters. They were to meet back at noon. By the time Gideon woke up, the men were returning. Some of the contingents had broken up into smaller groups, but now they came back in 4s and 5s, carrying tools, medical supplies, and bags of grain. Some escorted citizens who had been too afraid to approach the village, but now wanted in before it was too late. Gideon and Joab gave instructions, loading wagons with food and supplies, getting the people organized. One soldier came back carrying a crying baby boy. The baby had been found wrapped in a blanket and hidden under a bush. The home nearby had been burnt down. There were men, women, and children left dead in the field. The soldier came straight to Gideon and placed the baby in his arms. Gideon prayed the baby's family would be found alive, yet in his mind he named the child Caleb. The soldiers quickly took their lunch, and once that was done, loaded the injured onto stretchers, and a caravan of carts and stretchers and walking men with heavy loads began to move towards the village. At the head was Joab, sword unsheathed. Gideon walked in the middle, still carrying baby Caleb. Though the village was small, the trek was slow. Joab did not want the group to become spread too thin again, so when a makeshift stretcher broke, the whole caravan stopped. Again, when a bag of grain fell off a cart and split open, they stopped. Around the fringes of the group were soldiers who darted in and out of the surrounding homes and shops, looking for more that could be salvaged. It was an eerie feeling. There was a sense of certainty that this would be the last time they would walk down these very streets and find the homes standing. They passed through the square where the statue of Melchizedek still stood. Melchizedek the conqueror. Undoubtedly, the statue would be taken down and defiled. Still, no sign of the Mazikim. Cautiously, they moved down the narrow cobbled stone roads. They were nearly at the castle now, but as they rounded a corner, they discovered that the road had been blockaded. The Mazikim had taken tables and beds and wardrobes and other furniture and had thrown it all into a pile about a story high, blocking the entire road. "Blasted animals," Joab said. They are more intelligent than I thought. Then to his soldiers he added, Turn around. We have to go around the block. It took some time to turn the carts and the stretchers on the narrow roadway. Joab walked through the crowd to get to what had been the back, but would now be the front. As he did so, he heard the now familiar sound of a Mazikim in a nearby home. He froze, as did those around him, and looked up. There was a creature watching them from a window, its horrible grin distorting its face. It let out a low-drawn howl. As it did so, more Mazikim appeared in the windows of other houses. Ambush, Joab said to Gideon. The terrified citizens crowded into the middle of the group, shoving and tripping over one another. The soldiers, too, tightened in, holding their shaky swords out at the creatures. Several who were carrying bags put them down in order to draw swords. Gideon looked at the baby in his hands. Listen, he said. If we stay here and fight, we'll not get to the castle before nightfall. It'll be too dangerous then to open the gates, and we'll be trapped outside the castle for another night. So far, none of the Mazikim had made a move to attack. They just looked down on them from their second-story windows and grinned maniacally. I suspect that is their plan, Joab answered. It looks like we outnumber them, and in the light we have the advantage. They're biding their time. Then Joab shouted to his soldiers, If you're on the fringes, keep your swords drawn and your eyes and ears open. If you were carrying a load, then pick it up. We must keep moving. We cannot stay here. The group moved even more slowly now, packed closer together, some walking backwards so as not to keep their backs to the outside of the group. They returned to the square, turned left, and left again down the next road. This one would come out further from the castle gate than the initial route, but they would be near the castle wall longer and would have the protection of the archers for more of the journey. The men at the front stopped suddenly. 5 of the Mazikim darted across the road like large rats and into the houses that were now on their right. Once again, the grinning faces of the creatures appeared in second-story windows on the right and left. Keep moving, Joab instructed. They inched forward. Baby Caleb woke up in Gideon's arms. Whether it was because he had not been fed in some time or because he sensed the fear around him, baby Caleb began to cry violently. Gideon instinctively began to bounce the infant, but was not able to calm him. Some of the other children that they were trying to rescue began to cry as well. Gideon himself began to blink back the tears, not for fear of his own life, but for those entrusted to him. We must maintain hope, he said to a father near him. The father repeated, maintain hope, to his family. Somehow, just hearing the words came as a consolation to his wife. She was holding a 2-year-old girl, and riding on the back of one of the carts, she began repeating over and over to the child, maintain hope, maintain hope. Within a few minutes, the whole group had taken up the mantra. They repeated it quietly, over and over again, as they slowly made their way to the castle. But like the last road, this one curved to the left. As they rounded the bend, they discovered another blockade. At this, the mantra faltered, and the Mazikim, observing from above, broke once more into their hyena laughter. Joab himself began the mantra again, saying louder and more firmly, maintain hope, maintain hope. Again, the others joined through gritted teeth. Over the din of the mantra and the other sounds, Joab began to give instructions. We cannot continue to go around blockade after blockade, he said. The castle is just on the other side of this mound. We cannot go over it. We're going to have to work our way through it. Men, start working to tear the mound down. Some climbed over it and began to tear it down from the other side. From there, they could see the castle wall. Some of the men on the wall seemed to notice them, too. Soon it became apparent that more men would be required to move the blockade. Gideon reluctantly handed baby Caleb to the woman on the cart. He and the other men and some of the women who did not have children began to move towards the pile, but the mother in the cart said, But who will protect us? Gideon looked up at the windows. Sure enough, many of the Mazikim had left their positions, and others were leaving even then. Gideon assigned 20 men to stay with the carts and the citizens. The rest would help disassemble the blockade. Should an all-out assault begin, those on the blockade would be near enough to rejoin help in short order. Removing the blockade proved to be hot and heavy work. Most of the furniture was solid wood, And because the roadway was so narrow, some of it had to be carried a distance down the road to leave a gap wide enough for the carts to get through. Most of the men wore heavy metal armor. As they worked, Joab stood, watching and waiting. He knew an attack was imminent, but the Mazikim were inside the homes and in the alleys. He couldn't see them. The windows were dark, the doors shut. Suddenly, there was a shriek and a yell from on top of the mound. A Mazikai had leaped from a rooftop and landed on a soldier before he even had the opportunity to draw his sword. The air resounded then with more shrieks as creatures leaped off rooftops and out windows, landing on or near or behind soldiers. Some of them landed near the women, the children, and the injured, and attacked them. Gideon charged towards the cart where the mother and child and baby Caleb were, and swung his sword wide. He killed a Mazikai quickly, which looked ready to pounce. Then he stood on the cart over the women and 2 children. The woman's husband joined them on the other side of the cart. He too carried a sword, and the woman herself stood, holding a garden hoe for a weapon. Though the soldiers outnumbered the Mazikim about 2 to 1, the soldiers had one major disadvantage. That is, they valued their lives. The Mazikim seemed bent on nothing but destruction. They thrived on fear and death. The more blood that was spilled, the greater the grins and shrieks and howls of the creatures. Many of the soldiers had fallen now, their clumsy armor and swords outskilled by the agility of the creatures. But the soldiers fought for the victory they knew must be theirs. No alternative would be acceptable. Suddenly, the clamor of the battle stopped. There was a new noise in the village, a low, rhythmic thud, thud, thud. Joab realized that this was the sound of war drums. The enemy army was upon them at last. The Mazikim screamed with delight and fought with a new vigor. Joab shouted above it all just one word, "Hope!" And the men did not back off for fear or exhaustion, but continued to fight. Every man shared the same thoughts. Should they die now, they would die fighting evil. Joab managed to kill the Mazikai he was fighting, then climbed the mound to survey the scene. The sun was setting now. The enemy army was nearing the village. The injured and the citizens were too numerous. It'd be too difficult to get them over the mound, especially in the midst of a battle. So Joab began to work furiously, grabbing furniture from the mound and throwing it into the street below. Soon 2 other soldiers joined him. There was a hideous shriek behind him, and he spun around, sword in hand, to meet his adversary. But already the Mazikai had been shot through with an arrow. Joab looked to see where it had been shot from. To his astonishment, he discovered that the gates of the castle were open, and out poured an army of men on horses, come to join the battle. And who was leading the army but King Melchizedek himself? The remainder of the Mazikim fled then, leaving the soldiers unhindered as they broke down the barrier. The horsemen helped with the injured and the carts, and quickly got everyone into the castle gates. Just as the last of them came into the gates, Reuben yelled from the wall, "Shut the gates, now!" From where he stood, he could see the heads of the giants and the dragons flying low over the sea of torches.